Developing the knight to f3 immediately prepares for castling and controls central squares, aiming for a flexible, hypermodern setup. Asserting central space, this move immediately contests white's intention and aims for a solid pawn structure. Building a fianchettoed bishop for flank pressure, this prepares a kingside castle, aiming for solid development and a potential queenside expansion later. Developing the bishop to fianchetto opens a diagonal, potentially pressuring white's queenside control. Developing the bishop to g2 reinforces the fianchetto, preparing to castle and control the long diagonal, while keeping options open for further pawn structure adjustments. Solidifying the fianchetto allows for control of the long diagonal and prepares for castling, offering a robust pawn structure. Challenging black's central presence, this advance immediately generates central tension and opens lines for the queenside pawns. Solidifying the central pawn structure, black prepares to challenge white's queenside expansion with a flexible pawn chain. Asserting pressure on the queenside pawn, this gambit seeks to disrupt black's solid structure and gain early initiative. Challenging the queenside center, this thrust aggressively seizes central space and opens avenues for pieces. Solidifying the central pawn structure and opening a diagonal for the queen, white opts for a flexible approach, aiming to develop pieces harmoniously while preparing for potential pawn breaks later in the game. Shifting the knight to e7, black cultivates a robust pawn chain while preparing to reinforce the center with d4, a proactive maneuver aiming to seize central space and potentially launch a queenside expansion. Castling now secures the king, completing a crucial developmental stage and preparing the rook for potential action along the newly opened central files, a proactive step to avoid king safety becoming a lingering weakness in this developing position. Securing the monarch with castling aligns with fundamental king safety principles, but it also signals a commitment to a specific pawn structure that might invite central challenges from white's pieces. Unpinning the knight and increasing pressure on the d5 pawn, white aims to disrupt black's solid central pawn structure and potentially open lines for attack. Challenging the central structure with f6 immediately weakens the kingside pawn shield, potentially inviting dangerous diagonal pressure from the bishop on g2 and opening the f-file for white's rooks later. While it aims to solidify d5, it creates long-term structural vulnerabilities that require careful navigation. Reinforcing the queen's pressure on the queen side and preparing to potentially activate the bishop on the a3-f8 diagonal are the primary aims, though it does cede some central space temporarily. Asserting central dominance with d4 carves out valuable space on the queen side and disrupts white's light-squared ambitions, while simultaneously creating a protected passed pawn that could become a future asset. Opening the e-file for your rook while reinforcing the center, this maneuver subtly prepares to challenge black's advanced pawn on d4, potentially leading to a more dynamic middle game where controlling open lines becomes paramount. Striking the center with this pawn capture immediately challenges white's ambitious queenside pawn advance and injects tactical life into the position. Black wisely consolidates their central pawn structure, aiming to create a solid block that will impede white's pieces from further infiltration. This clears the way for the knight to potentially redeploy to a more active square, while also opening a diagonal for the bishop. Liberating the bishop from its fianchettoed post, this square exchange injects new life into white's central presence. The bishop now eyes the queenside diagonal, promising future pressure on black's pawn structure, while simultaneously offering a defensive shield for the king. This maneuver strategically redeems the piece after black's aggressive central push, aiming to contest control of key squares and potentially unravel black's somewhat cramped queenside. Black boldly advances the knight, establishing a strong outpost on f5 and directly challenging white's central structure, particularly the advanced e3 pawn. This maneuver introduces significant dynamism, potentially forcing white into defensive postures or tactical calculations to dislodge the invading piece, while simultaneously preparing for further pawn breaks or piece development on the kingside. The knight's journey to a3 seems quite circuitous, aiming to redeploy to c4 or perhaps b5, Yet it sacrifices immediate central influence for a tempo-gaining maneuver that could leave white's queenside feeling a bit exposed, while black solidifies their pawn chain. Embarking on a journey to the queenside, this knight's migration aims to bolster the a7-g1 diagonal and potentially challenge white's queenside structure by eyeing c5. However, the knight's exile to the rim, far from the center's fray, sacrifices valuable central influence and tempo, leaving the king's defenses potentially thinner if white can exploit the queenside space. Injecting a rook onto the central file immediately contests black's space advantage, aiming to disrupt their pawn chain and potentially exploit the exposed d4 pawn. Swapping pieces on e3, black initiates a sequence that immediately reshapes the central pawn structure, liberating the bishop on g7 and clearing a pathway for the queen. This exchange, while seemingly simplifying, creates a dynamic imbalance. White's knight on a3 now looks rather out of play, and the d4 pawn, once a point of contention, becomes a potential target in the coming maneuvers. Opening the f-file immediately creates dynamic imbalances, as the pawn structure is now fractured for white, potentially offering attacking chances down that open avenue, though it also weakens the king's shelter and invites aggressive counterplay if black can exploit the created weaknesses. Intensifying the queenside pressure, qb6 immediately challenges the white queen and eyes the pawn on b2, forcing white to consider defensive maneuvers rather than consolidating their central pawn structure. Pivoting the knight to c2 aims to redeploy it to a more active square, potentially the b4 outpost or even a5, offering better scope than its current restrictive position on a3 and reinforcing control over key central squares that black now dominates. Unraveling the queenside pressure by forcing an exchange, black aims to simplify while disrupting white's centralized queen, potentially leading to a more manageable middle game structure with open lines for their pieces. The open file now presents a clear avenue for black's rook, potentially creating persistent pressure on the queenside. Black aims to activate the bishop, utilizing the open diagonal and eyeing potential weaknesses around white's kingside, while simultaneously preparing to challenge white's central pawn structure and potentially open up lines for further piece activity. Seizing initiative on the kingside, white aims to dislodge black's knight from its outpost, simultaneously opening lines for the rook while creating potential attacking chances near black's king. Black solidifies the bishop's influence by planting it on g4, preparing to challenge white's knight and potentially disrupt the pawn structure around the kingside. Opening up a diagonal for the queen's bishop and preparing to potentially contest the central files, this repositioning aims to activate the bishop from its relatively passive post, seeking to exploit the weakened dark squares around black's king and potentially create threats along the b1h7 diagonal. Immediately challenging the central pawn structure, black seeks to disrupt white's well-coordinated pieces and potentially open lines towards the king. This proactive approach aims to exploit any slight awkwardness in white's knight placement and create dynamic play. Re-establishing contact on the king's flank, the bishop retreats to its initial square, seeking to re-enter the fray and potentially support a queenside initiative or even a central pawn push after further preparation. Pondering the bishop's repositioning, black subtly aims to solidify the pawn structure by offering a trade, hoping to open lines for their pieces and create potential weaknesses in white's kingside as the game progresses. Retreating the bishop to the same square suggests white is content with a quiet regrouping, possibly eyeing a queenside expansion or reinforcing central control after the exchange of queens. A subtle regrouping effort, seeking to establish a more robust defensive setup for the king and prepare a potential advance on the queenside, while simultaneously challenging white's bishop on e3, which has been a persistent nuisance. Unlocking the central tension, white injects dynamism into a seemingly static position, aiming to shatter black's pawn chain and open lines for piece activity. Opening the d-file with the rook is a natural response, aiming to contest the newly liberated central file after white's ambitious d4 push, and it immediately puts pressure on white's central pawn structure. Securing the queenside and preparing to contest the file marks a crucial moment, as white intends to challenge black's control and potentially launch an assault. The knight's journey to the c7 square signals a subtle repositioning, aiming to bolster the pawn chain and prepare for a potential advance on the queen side, perhaps targeting the c4 pawn or simply finding a more secure outpost away from white's active pieces. This maneuver also frees up the b8 square for its counterpart, hinting at a coordinated maneuver to challenge white's central control. The rook's migration to the edge of the board creates interesting imbalances. This maneuver seems to aim at increasing the pressure along the file, potentially preparing for a queenside advance or to support a future pawn push like a4. It also indirectly loosens black's queenside pawn structure by forcing consideration of their advance. The rook is now well placed to contest open files if they arise, and can also switch to the other flank if the position demands it. However, it does momentarily abandon central control, which black might try to exploit. The placement also subtly puts pressure on the c7 pawn, hinting at future tactical possibilities. Preparing to contest the open, a file now that the rook has moved off it, black aims to prevent white's potential queenside expansion and begin creating their own counterplay down the flank. Recentralizing the bishop to g2 hints at a potential regrouping or perhaps preparing for a defensive maneuver, as the piece had previously been quite active on the queen side, now returning to a more familiar home square to potentially support other pieces or assess the evolving pawn structure. Initiating a slow, methodical repositioning of the rook to the open d-file, aiming to pressure the central pawn structure and prepare for potential breakthroughs or exchanges, while simultaneously reinforcing the queen's side defense. A repositioning maneuver, nf3 seeks to activate the knight from its passive post on a3, aiming to contest the central squares and potentially support a kingside initiative, or simply improve its overall coordination. Initiating a strategic repositioning, the rook embarks on a journey to potentially control the open file, anticipating future action and bolstering the defense of the castled king by providing an additional layer of protection. Repositioning the knight to e1 signals a subtle but significant shift, preparing to redeploy it to a more active square, potentially f3 or even g2, to reinforce the center or support a kingside initiative that has been stalled. The knight's current location on a3, isolated and out of play, has been a positional drawback, and this maneuver seeks to rectify that by bringing it back into the game's core. It hints at a patient approach, aiming to improve piece placement before committing to further pawn advances or direct confrontations, recognizing that the queenside play from black with the rook on a8 and knight on c7 is not currently a major threat. This knight move is a quiet effort to rebalance white's forces and create a more harmonious setup for the upcoming middle game struggle. Exploiting white's momentarily vulnerable central pawn, black seizes the opportunity to simplify the position and disrupt white's pawn structure. This exchange clears the e-file, potentially opening avenues for black's rook, while simultaneously forcing white to recapture and commit to a potentially weaker pawn formation on the king side. Opening the central file with 27, x4 immediately injects a dynamic element, creating both opportunities and potential vulnerabilities. White, by capturing, aims to seize the open file for their rook, which could prove decisive later if black isn't careful. However, this exchange also brings black's bishop on g7 into a more active position, potentially eyeing the d4 pawn. The pawn structure is now asymmetrical, hinting at future maneuvering. Pay close attention to how white repositions their pieces to exploit this newfound central control. Pushing the f-pawn here creates a fascinating positional dilemma, potentially opening a path for the king's safety or inviting immediate structural weaknesses. Repositioning the knight to its initial square suggests a reassessment of the central pawn structure and a desire to activate it on the king side, perhaps eyeing the weakened squares around black's monarch if the f-pawn advances further. Reasserting central influence with the rook, black aims to break white's pawn chain and potentially unblock the d-file for increased piece activity. Injecting a central pawn thrust, this maneuver aims to destabilize black's somewhat passive pawn chain and potentially open lines for white's pieces. The knight's journey to e5 is a bold one, aiming to occupy a more active square and create immediate pressure on the d7 rook and the pawn structure. Observe how this knight's new position challenges black's setup, forcing a reaction and potentially leading to imbalances. Reorienting the bishop towards the queenside seeks to challenge white's initiative on the open a file and potentially redeploy this piece to a more active square, perhaps targeting the central pawn structure if white miscalculates their central pawn push. Opening the rook's path, this initiative aims to activate the sidelined piece and challenge black's central grip, potentially leading to open files and increased piece activity as the position transitions towards a more dynamic character. Opening the f-file here, though seemingly active, presents a dangerous vulnerability for your king, potentially inviting a swift and decisive attack through the newly created open lane. Opening the g-file, albeit at the cost of pawn structure, signals white's intention to finally exploit a potential weakness on the kingside, aiming to infiltrate with the rook and pressure black's uncastled monarch or underdeveloped pieces. Challenging white's central pawn chain, black seeks to disrupt its structure and open lines for its pieces. Slicing through the congested center, this pawn's aggressive advance aims to dismantle black's tightly packed pawn chain and pry open lines for white's pieces, particularly the rook on a5. This maneuver now firmly anchors the rook on a central file, preparing to contest the open d-file and potentially harass white's isolated pawn structure. Opening the center with this pawn thrust, white seeks to disrupt black's pawn chain and potentially exploit the newly created avenues for their pieces. Embracing the pawn storm now seems crucial, as the central pawn chain has been broken, opening avenues for piece activity. Unlocking the c-file and creating immediate pressure along it, this push aims to disrupt black's central pawn structure and prepare a potential breakthrough. Unleashing the knight to d5 seizes a crucial central outpost, disrupting white's pawn chain and threatening to open lines towards the king. Suddenly, the queenside pawns awaken, threatening to become unstoppable forces as the c-pawn surges forward to sever black's connection to its own defenses. The rook's redeployment to d6 aims to solidify the pawn chain's base and prepare for potential counterplay on the kingside, but it surrenders the crucial d5 square to white's advancing pawn, potentially creating a decisive passed pawn. Reclaiming the initiative and eyeballing the a7 pawn, the knight repositions to create threats. The knight's retreat to e8 surrenders the initiative on the kingside, allowing white to press forward with their pawns and seize control of the central files. Re-establishing a knight on its rightful central pathway promises to invigorate white's beleaguered position. Snatching the d-pawn opens a dangerous diagonal for your bishop, and by repositioning your knight, you're preparing to harass the white queen. This bold capture injects immediate tactical life into the position, potentially forcing concessions or creating exploitable weaknesses in white's pawn structure. Reclaiming the central outpost for the knight offers a chance to finally disrupt black's entrenched pawn structure and potentially exploit the exposed king. Unleashing a forcing check, black disrupts white's rook coordination and attempts to pry open the c-file, potentially setting up a future queenside play. Shifting the king to the first rank offers a crucial escape route, anticipating potential threats from black's bishop on d4 and knight on d3, while also preparing for the endgame that looms with the pawn structure fractured. Relinquishing the open e-file with the exchange, now black opts for simplifying the position, accepting that the active white rook will be removed, but the central pawns remain locked in place, potentially setting up a slow maneuvering game. Clearing the path for your knight allows it to enter the fray with renewed purpose, potentially pinning down black's pieces or setting up a more active defense on the kingside. Reclaiming the central squares is paramount for black after the king's escape and the exchange of queens, and this bishop repositions to eye the now exposed white king's diagonal. Rallying the rook to contest the open d-file, aiming to disrupt black's newly organized pawn chain and prevent further aggressive advances. The rook's recapture of the pawn immediately offers a simplification, aiming to alleviate the pressure on black's position by trading off pieces. Sacrificing the bishop here creates a pawn thunderstorm on the kingside and opens lines for a decisive attack. Safeguarding the monarch is paramount as the material balance shifts, aiming to connect the remaining rooks and prepare for the inevitable pawn advances. Consolidating pieces to defend against black's active pawn push and repositioning for a potential counterattack. Mobilizing the king towards the center is crucial for navigating this endgame. Shifting the king to the safer square avoids potential checks and prepares for piece redistribution. The exchange of the bishop for the knight frees the black king from any immediate checks along that diagonal and sets the stage for a potential pawn race in the center once the pieces clear. Unlocking the H-file for potential rook activity offers a strategic alternative to directly confronting the pawn majority. The bishop retreats, seeking safety and better square occupation as the pawn structure has become rather complex and potentially dangerous. Clearing a path for the monarch to join the fray. Securing the d4 pawn with a pawn shield creates a subtle but important fortification for the monarch, while also preventing any immediate pawn breaks by the opponent on that square. Unlocking the d-file for the rook is the primary objective here, aiming to exploit the precariousness of black's bishop on c7 and potentially create mating threats down the open file. Bringing the bishop back to e7 aims to reinforce the pawn chain and prepare for potential kingside activity, or to reposition for defense if white's knight advances further. Unleashing the king into the fray, the monarch marches forward, seeking to actively participate in the endgame's strategic dance. Consolidating the king's position is paramount, offering it a more secure haven on g7, away from the central fray and potential future pawn advances. Shifting the king forward is a proactive step, aiming to secure a more active central post as the queens have been exchanged, and the material simplifies, potentially ushering in an endgame where king activity becomes paramount. A prudent retreat, repositioning the bishop to defend the weakened kingside pawn structure and prepare for potential exchanges that could simplify into a favorable endgame for black, given white's slightly disconnected pieces. Nabbing that isolated pawn offers immediate material gain, but consider the potential for black's bishop to become a real menace if it's allowed to reposition aggressively. The bishop bravely occupies the outpost, eyeing the vulnerable kingside pawns and threatening further disruption to white's defensive structure. Opening the path for your rook to rejoin the fray after black's passive bishop retreat. Sacrificing the bishop for a pawn in this simplified endgame seems to be a desperate attempt to disrupt white's advancing pawns, but it leaves black's king dangerously exposed and forfeits all hope of counterplay against white's powerful passed pawn on the c-file. Pondering the king's next journey, white opts to advance it, a critical decision in this simplified material landscape. This advance, kf3*, aims to activate the monarch, preparing it to potentially support the d-pawn's remaining strength or even challenge black's bishop opposition. It's a subtle yet crucial shift from passive defense to active participation, recognizing the endgame's unique demands where the king often becomes a fighting piece, not just a target. The bishop retreats, a seemingly passive maneuver, but one that subtly repositions it to a more active diagonal, aiming to influence the central pawn mass and potentially support an eventual kingside advance for black. Advancing the pawn creates a potential path for the king to become an active participant in the endgame, aiming to support the remaining pieces and potentially create a passed pawn later on. Sensing an opportunity to solidify its pawn structure and potentially create a passed pawn with its king now actively involved, black chooses to reposition its bishop, aiming to bolster the kingside defense and prepare for further maneuvering in this unfolding endgame. King disruption beckons as the knight forgoes pawn capture, aiming to exploit the now exposed monarch and create mating threats. The knight's bold advance to e6 completely dictates the board, trapping the black king and forcing a devastating concession. Seeking to disrupt the well-entrenched black bishop and potentially initiate a favorable pawn race in the endgame, this knight repositions to a more aggressive square. Sacrificing material to open a path for the king and potentially activate the rook seems to be the desperate gambit here, hoping to exploit any lingering weaknesses in white's pawn structure. The bishop now vacates the d3 square, potentially preparing to join the assault on the kingside or to find a more active post elsewhere on the board. Unleashing a desperate check, Black hopes to disrupt White's carefully positioned pieces and perhaps expose the monarch.